In 2001, Final Fantasy X was released to most of the world with huge success, and it quickly became a series favorite for many. Not long after its release, gaming message boards were alive with topics covering how to beat the game, why people hated Blitzball so much, and most importantly, who was the best waifu. However, there were others who claimed the game was too easy, so it wasn't long before people found ways to get the challenge they were looking for. The first of these was no sphere grid. In 2002, people started to claim they beat Final Fantasy X without the game's iconic leveling system, giving details about how they did it. Over the years, the NSG challenge has not only become one of the most iconic in the entire Final Fantasy series, but it also serves as a gateway to more difficult ones. As a result, the documentation and community support has made NSG not as tough as it was in years past. In fact, people even speedrun this category, showing how far it's come over the past 25 years. But there are bosses in this challenge that are much harder than the rest, and one of these comes from the game's international release back in May of 2002. This version, which the FF10 HD remaster is based off of, has an expanded leveling system and many balance changes. Even more importantly, this version adds several super bosses to the game. These are the Dark Aeons, which are the evil counterparts to the summons that Yuna gets from each Temple of Yevon. These bosses are difficult if you're unprepared, which is most of the time since they jump scare unsuspecting players after they spawn. Now, imagine fighting these bosses without any sphere grid upgrades. Surprisingly, it only took a few months for someone to beat most of these Dark Aeons, but there was one that remained undefeated, and it would stay that way for a long time. This is Dark Anima, and this is the story of the quest to defeat this complete nightmare of a boss with no sphere grid and no Zanmato.
Wait!
This year, my goal is to reach 100,000 subscribers on this channel. If you enjoy my videos and want to see more like these, it would mean the world to me if you hit the subscribe button and join me on my quest to learn all about these amazing RPG challenges and speedruns. Grab a glass of water, and let's get into today's video. In March of 2002, 3.5 months after the Western release of Final Fantasy X, users Dustman and Zarus posted a guide on GameFAQs detailing how to beat the game with no sphere grid thanks to a ton of input from the community. The early parts of the game are similar to a regular playthrough, but with more of a focus on using Aeons like Valfor to be your damage dealers. It's not until you reach Sinspawn Gui where the difficulty ramps up. From here, people have to plan more aspects of their items, equipment, and overdrives to beat each boss. For example, Kimahri's self-destruct overdrive he learns help dish out the damage needed to beat Sinspawn Gui. After you get Riku, her mix overdrive carries you through most of the game, letting you use Trio of 9999 and things like fire gems to dish out almost 50,000 damage in a turn. The only thing is you need a lot more than Brawn to finish an NSG playthrough. FF10's equipment abilities and customization system also play a huge role in any NSG run. Weapon abilities such as First Strike to always have that character go first in battle, and Initiative to prevent ambushes are required to get through random encounters. Armor abilities like Auto Haste, Auto Phoenix, and Auto Potion are essential to keep party members going against bosses, despite the lack of stats. With so many safety nets, it's no wonder that people wanted to move towards harder challenges that restricted things like overdrives and Aeon summons, but there were some people who wanted to beat every boss in the regular NSG challenge. In August of 2002, a well-known challenge community member by the name of Hyprofant finished the No Sphere Grid Monster Arena FAQ, detailing strategies to beat the bosses in the monster arena located in the Calmlands. In November of the same year, another user by the name of Clink added strategies to take down the Dark Aeons. Outside of using Yojimbo's Zanmato to take them down, these fights required a lot of patience and a deep understanding of game mechanics to complete. Unfortunately, you couldn't just go into these fights and expect to win, even with the correct gear. Beating these bosses requires you to increase the stats of your Aeons. While you can't power up your own characters, NSG does allow you to power up your Aeons. This is done in two different ways. The amount of battles your party gets into naturally increases the stats of all Aeons up to a certain point, but you can also use spheres and other items to increase your stats after you get the Aeon Soul from Belgemine. Klink's strat here was to increase the stats of Anima to the point where she could be used as the main damage dealer against a lot of these Dark Aeons. This, in combination with some other strats used for survivability, allowed challengers to win most of these fights. When it came to take on Dark Anima though, this strat wasn't going to fly. In fact, this fight was a barrier that Klink couldn't overcome. Dark Anima comes in with a whopping 8 million HP, the most out of all the Dark Aeons except for Yojimbo if you're counting all of his fights combined. Dark Anima has 3 attacks that she has a 33% chance to use at any given time. Her regular attack that hits you with a Shattering Petrification and Curse, which is the most favorable choice. Pain, an attack that inflicts instant death even against Aeons. Then there's Mega Graviton, an area of effect spell that does damage proportional to 43.8% of each target's max HP. Like the other Dark Aeons, she has access to her overdrive in the form of Oblivion. This is a devastating attack that not only deals a ton of HP damage to the party, but also drains their MP as well. To prep for this fight, Klink wanted Titus, Wakka, and Riku to have First Strike, Evade and Counter, Triple Overdrive, and Alchemy on their weapons, and Yuna would just have Evade and Counter and Alchemy. In terms of armor, Ribbon to make yourself immune to status effects was extremely important. Auto Haste and Auto Phoenix were expected, but another ability he wanted was Auto Regen. Regen gives automatic heals after each turn, giving you a good chance at surviving multiple Mega Gravitons in a row. If you're looking to deal meaningful damage with Aeons against Dark Anima, you need to grind for spheres that increase stats manually. As a reference, these are the stats that Klink wanted on his Anima by the time he got to the end of the Dark Aeons. These numbers are no joke, and involve fights with arena monsters like Katos to repeatedly boost those numbers. Klink's file at the time he wrote his guide was 195 hours, and that was just to grind out one Aeon. When it comes to battle strategy, it was the trio, deal as much damage as he could with multi-hit overdrives like Wakka's attack reels and Titus's slice and dice, then switch to an Aeon right before Dark Anima used Oblivion to take the hit. This is done with an Aeon's shield ability, reducing the damage from Oblivion immensely. He'd also bank on getting a hit or two in with an Aeon for extra damage output, specifically the Magus Sisters before Dark Anima got in a turn. Since there's 3 of them, this would be the best option for damage without risking the main party. Now of course, these strategies depend on everything going completely right, and the chances of that are extremely slim. You're going into this with base stats for your characters, so compared to the active party, Dark Anima is extremely fast. When she manages to kill someone, it'll be 4 turns before that character gets another turn. Unless it's Riku, then you get 3, but that doesn't make much of a difference if you're constantly dying. So Klink had to hope that Dark Anima would consistently target Wakka, since he's really only there for additional damage. Dark Anima can also just repeatedly spam Mega Graviton, killing the party in just a few turns. Riku does put up Hyper Mighty G at the start of the fight, giving the party Protect, Shell, Haste, Regen, and Auto Life, but has to reapply every so often to ensure Auto Life is consistently present. Meaningful damage from party members isn't consistent, which is why Klink relies on the Magus Sisters for damage. This is a huge risk, since the Magus Sisters are not entirely controllable. Each sister has commands that let them randomly choose from a pool of attacks and abilities for them to use. Some of these commands even only show up after meeting certain criteria, like one of the sisters being under half HP. They also do a move that's literally just taking a break, meaning they do nothing and you die a little bit inside. Between that and using abilities you don't want to see, the sisters are both your best chance at winning this fight, and the main reason you'll want to throw your controller at the TV. Based on Klink's damage estimates and how things would work in an optimal run, he concluded that the fight could be finished in 23 rounds or 23 Dark Anima Oblivions if everything went well. Given that Dark Anima could end your run for any reason at any time, the likelihood of this happening was extremely low. To put it in perspective, Dark Anima has a 2 out of 3 chance to use a move that will kill any party member. After the first round and losing your Hyper Mighty G status, you really want to resummon with Yuna as soon as possible, beating out the next Oblivion. You also don't want Riku and Yuna to die after that, letting Riku reapply her Hyper Mighty G and also letting Yuna summon again. This, combined with the RNG from the Magus Sisters, meant that winning this fight would take a ridiculous amount of luck. But the odds were not impossible. In fact, Clink shared the same sentiment, but he also believed that it could very well take someone a lifetime of attempts before winning. And so, Clink documented his strategies, and in doing so, he gave the FF10 challenge community the tools they needed to take on Dark Anima. Over the next few years, the challenge scene would become more popular and see a ton of growth. NSG challenges would expand to include things like no overdrives, no customization, and many other restrictions, but NSG Dark Anima would remain unbeaten. However, by around 2006 to 2007, there were a few prolific challengers working on the boss: Anorn, Blitzace 470, Manudude02, X8M, and Dark Kefka. Blitz and Manudude were known in the community as top-tier challenge runners, with Blitz clearing things like NSGNZ. All the other runners had their own achievements, but Dark Kefka was a little bit different. He didn't have many contributions to these strategies, but by standing on the backs of existing giants, he spread the word of the NSG challenge to a wider audience on YouTube, getting more people into the community. In fact, I watched a few of DK's Dark Anima NSG videos back in high school, thinking it was so cool that anyone could beat these bosses with no upgrades. In terms of attempts against Dark Anima, most information is lost to time. GameFAQs was a great hub for the challenge community, but up until 2008, forum threads would be purged after inactivity for a certain amount of time. The earliest of these discussion threads that survived was titled No Sphere Grid Dark Anima, and it's the first time several Dark Anima NSG personal bests were documented. Manudude reached around 300k damage at one point, which doesn't seem like a lot, but even that amount is something to be proud of given how much luck you need for this challenge. The NSG fight against Dark Anima took an ungodly amount of preparation. Yeah, you had to get your equipment up to snuff, but grinding out all of the Aeon stats to what's required at a minimum would take hundreds of hours. Strength spheres would be farmed to increase HP and attack damage, mana spheres for MP, speed spheres to increase agility for more turns, and finally fortune spheres for luck, increasing your chance of critical hits. What's even crazier about this grind is the more you increase a stat, the more spheres it takes for the next stat increase. Imagine doing this for HP and agility on 5 Aeons, then having to get high HP, max strength, defense, agility, and luck on the Magus Sisters. I can't stress enough how hard it is to increase the luck stat for Aeons in this game. You need to get fortune spheres, and the best way to grind for those is from the Earth Eater in the monster arena. Thankfully, the community figured out they didn't need to completely max out stats to take on Dark Anima, since everything after a certain point didn't matter due to pain meaning instant death. Another huge thing challengers realized was that it was worth mostly using the Magus Sisters over the party for dealing damage. Overall, you'll get more turns and damage from the sisters, even with your outcomes coming down to sheer luck. To make this happen, the idea was to have Sandy cast haste as much as possible, get Cindy to keep casting auto life, and Mindy to fire off Passido, dealing over 100,000 damage a pop. Around this time, another challenge runner by the name of Chaos N shared a strat to get more out of auto life on the party when using Hyper Mighty G. It turns out, plus magic abilities on the weapon of whoever casts auto life increases the potency of the revive. Normally, you get revived with only 25% of your max HP, which can leave you vulnerable to a Mega Graviton death, but this was a game changer, and combined with auto regen on character armor, this helped out a lot. Auto Potion was also considered on some characters instead of auto regen, giving additional healing coverage after a Mega Graviton. When Clink was doing attempts back in the early days, he claimed just over 2 million damage before putting the challenge down. Still, not even this was the record as of 2008. Blitzace actually held this title with an incredible 3.5 million damage claimed on his best attempt. This showed the power of the Magus Sisters when they cooperated, and even if a win was unlikely, it wasn't impossible if someone kept working at it. One thing that was a huge deal in extending attempts was understanding how characters would take turns in battle. The conditional turn battle system is what FF10 uses to determine who takes a turn in what order, and the mechanics are surprisingly complex. Each party member and monster has a base CTB value that's derived from their agility. The higher the agility, the lower this base value. From the start of the battle, after your initial value is assigned, the game reduces everyone's CTB until someone hits 0. When that happens, it becomes that person's turn. Another important thing to note here is if you have first strike on a weapon, your initial CTB value is automatically set to 0 for the first turn. When you attack or perform any other action, it increases your CTB value back up to a certain point. This is based on the delay or rank value of that action. Some actions have lower recovery time, like quick hit, while others have higher recovery time, such as overdrives. What happens is the character's base CTB value is multiplied by the used action's rank, and it will put you at that point in the turn order. If that value is lower than what the enemy has, you can get another turn before the enemy. Your CTB value can also be modified mid-turn with haste and slow abilities. Haste will divide your current CTB value by half when active, effectively doubling your turn count. This also sheds some light on other mechanics involving CTB that we have to be aware of. When a character is revived, their CTB value is always set to their base times 3, regardless if they're hasted or slowed. The delay mechanic is also why you'll see players change their equipment sometimes during battle, since that action has a rank of 1, setting your CTB value to its base. It's these things and more that help the community determine things like how many turns the party could get before an Oblivion, or when Yuna could get her next summon in. However, the challenge threads as a whole lean more towards popular categories, including the iconic NSG, NS, NC, NO, NE, NNE, and BB challenge that I made a history video on a couple years ago. Going into spring of 2008, it didn't look like any newer challengers were ready to take on Dark Anima, and community veterans weren't making any progress, but someone new to the NSG challenge thread would make their first post, and his name was Burke Ice. Burke, also more famously known as Dan's Go 8, was already aware of the many challenges that FF10 had to offer. This was his favorite game, and the Dark Anima NSG challenge was just the thing he was looking for. He wanted to be the first one to beat this boss, so in summer of 2007, this 15-year-old FF10 enthusiast got to work, and considering he'd never done an NSG challenge before, he was in for the grind of a lifetime. In 2008, Burke started asking questions about the Earth Eater fight and other general questions about the Dark Anima grind, and it turned out he was very knowledgeable about the game despite being new to the forum. By 2009, he was at the point where he could use Anima to beat the Dark Aeons, documenting his clears as he achieved them. One by one they fell, and after 340 hours of playtime, it was finally time for him to start grinding out the Magus Sisters stats. This was the second barrier before actually fighting Dark Anima, but he was determined, and after only 3 months, something unexpected happened. My man got bored of the grind and moved on to fighting NSG Shinryu, which by the way, I also have a video covering that challenge. You should go watch it after this one, thanks. Taking hundreds, if not thousands of hours to even reach the point of fighting a boss can be exhausting, even for the most determined of players. Between that and going to university starting in 2009, it was easier to focus on a grind that he was already prepared for with attempts that were considerably shorter than a Dark Anima fight. Still, it didn't stop Burke from trying again in 2010, and it seemed like he was making a good amount of progress on his stats. His sisters were pretty much good to go outside of agility, luck, and MP. However, even with all of his progress, he was at least another year or two away from even thinking about doing attempts against Dark Anima. Burke spent a total of 3 years leveling his Aeons to somewhat be ready for Dark Anima, and it was at this point he realized something important. Why would he waste more time grinding out his stats when he can just attempt the fight with a file that already had them? This was a valid question, and honestly not that controversial. You see, several community members got to the point where they didn't bother increasing stats manually anymore. Burke ended up discovering FFX around this time, a program that let you modify various parts of your save file. Given that Burke already had over 1,000 hours on his save file and increasingly limited time due to his university studies, he decided to get the stats needed for his Aeons and strictly focus on beating Dark Anima. While there were some naysayers, people on the GameFAQs forum were mostly supportive and pushed Burke to continue his attempts. Burke also worked on testing and using new strategies he came up with for the fight. These weren't anything huge, mainly just small changes to help survivability. He wanted to have Sandy and Mindy at 9,999 HP to get as much out of full life as he could, and Cindy to have lower HP to benefit from Prey, which restores some HP to the party at no MP cost. For regular party members, Burke had an idea from a YouTube comment to give Yuna Auto Potion and Auto Regen to help her survive if Dark Anima did multiple Mega Gravitons in a row. This was big because before then, if you got hit with 2 in a row, your run was over. Burke would take these strats into future runs, and it wasn't long before he got back into the swing of things. He actually was doing attempts off and on during the spring of 2011 and was trying to get a few more in before an exam coming up in the next week. An hour and a half after Burke shared he was doing attempts, he came back with the post that he was at nearly 4 million damage into the fight. This was the halfway point, and further than anyone else had gotten before then. The likelihood of anyone reaching this point is incredibly slim, given how many things can go wrong with turn order, party members dying, or the sisters not cooperating. Getting any measurable damage already takes a lot of luck, but getting 4 million? This was a once-in-a-lifetime run, even if it didn't finish. Burke was beside himself at this point. He knew his luck was insane, and was both excited and nervous about what was to come next. Still, he would continue the fight and hope that Dark Anima would give him the win. Soon he reached 5 million, then 6 million, 7 million, and finally, on May 17th, 2011, it happened. The fight didn't get off to a great start, with Dark Anima targeting Sandy instantly. Thankfully, Cindy had an auto life on Sandy, and the very next turn, Sandy used haste on Cindy. Getting a haste is already a difficult task, let alone getting it on a character that matters. Even better, Sandy responded to the one more time command, casting haste again on herself, and finally on Mindy. For the regular party, Anima was very nice, hitting Waku with single target attacks instead of the other party members. When Anima decided to use Mega Graviton, it was mostly when the Magus sisters weren't out. Burke also got lucky with Yuna not dying when Hyper Mighty Guard wasn't up and Anima had a turn, and was able to catch when he needed to switch Riku out for Titus to manipulate an earlier turn for Riku. In the same vein, there are some scenarios where summoning an Aeon is better than using HMG since there's less turn delay, but it's really dependent on how close Dark Anima is to using her overdrive. Another strategy when Yuna is constantly being targeted is to use Trio of 9999 and get damage in with Waka, as long as Dark Anima's overdrive gauge is at a safe spot. This accounts for another 100,000 damage, so it helps move the fight along when you can't summon the sisters. However, this is a dangerous situation to be in, and if every party member dies at some point, there's no way to survive Oblivion, ending the attempt. Burke actually had to deal with this in his clear. Starting at the 46-minute mark, he only summoned the sisters twice over the next 30 minutes. Because he was stuck with the regular party, there were many instances where Yuna and Riku had to survive several turns in a row for the run to work out. In some cases, he'd switch out one of the characters for Titus to do a rank 1 action, pushing his CTB just enough to give Riku or Yuna an earlier next turn. This helped a little bit, but with party members dying a ton, there's a chance you'll run out of Phoenix Downs before the end of the fight, like Burke almost did during his attempt, going from 76 to 17 by the time it was all over. There were a ton of close calls, but eventually Burke pulled through and clutched the win in at the end. The community was in awe, with all the active FF10 challenge players congratulating Burke on his win. Again, everyone knew this was possible, but the likelihood of any of them getting the win was extremely low. Still, he was able to pull it off, and Burke could finally move on to other challenges without this one lingering on his mind. However, this wasn't the end of this challenge's story. In fact, this was just the end of one era and the beginning of a new one. You see, when it comes to challenges like these, the first clear usually ends up causing the floodgates to open, motivating older community members and bringing in new ones. While Burke is still the only person to ever beat Dark Anima NSG, there's some people who have come extremely close. While the chapter on the first Dark Anima NSG clear has closed, huge progress has been made in the 15 years since Burke's groundbreaking achievement. Around October of 2016, a new runner by the name of Adamance13 started an NSG run, and by 2017, he was able to beat all the Dark Aeons except for Dark Anima. He wanted to do the full grind and fight the boss on that file, but Adamance had no idea what he was getting into. He did grinding against the Earth Eater for 2.5 years before he got the luck needed to regularly get critical hits against Dark Anima, but thankfully part of this grind was made easier due to using the HD remaster of the game and having a save transfer onto his PlayStation Vita, letting him grind while away from his main console. After a few test attempts in 2019 and realizing he didn't have enough luck to fight Dark Anima, he grinded a little bit more, and in April of 2020, Adamance was finally done raising his stats and could focus on the actual fight. Over the course of his grind, he used some different strategies than Burke, one of which had a major impact on how Yuna was set up for the fight. Normally, Yuna would have auto haste, auto regen, auto potion, and ribbon on her armor. Longtime FF10 challenge community member Coryphean suggested that instead of using auto haste, you could instead put on auto phoenix and have Riku use a chocobo feather as a haste source. Remember what I said about your CTB value always being your base times 3 when being revived, no matter if you're hasted or not? You can get around this by not being hasted when revived, then applying the haste effect after, cutting your current CTB value in half. This was huge, taking Yuna's 4-turn recovery time and changing it to 2 turns. Then, by putting auto potion instead of auto phoenix on Riku, this ensured Riku and Yuna didn't die to Mega Graviton after being revived by auto life. This has some drawbacks, like not being able to mix Trio to get extra damage from Waka. Since you now have to use Riku's turn to haste Yuna, or go for the HMG and summon like all runs currently do, there's not much room for the regular party to do anything else. It's not clear if this strategy is better or not, but overall it creates another layer of survivability with the roulette that is Dark Anima. Adamance is still doing attempts to this day, with over 1,600 hours documented so far, and his personal best sitting at 5.65 million damage. Another challenger by the name of PandoraJane already had a lot of experience with speedrunning NSG Dark Aeon fights prior to taking on the Dark Anima NSG challenge. She actually plays on the international PS2 version of the game with over 2,000 hours on her manual grind save file. Compared to Adamance, she's used the more traditional method to take on NSG Dark Anima, but more recently got into how RNG manipulation could get her a clear. Putting it extremely simply, all of FF10's random events are driven by a random number generator system. There's 68 different RNG numbers that are used for many things in the game. The numbers that are randomly rolled for these progress based on a set seed that's created when you hit new game and is tied to that save file. This means that RNG in the game is predictable and can be tracked. In this case, Jane wants to manipulate outcomes within the Dark Anima fight, so values like RNG2 and RNG4 would need to be tracked. RNG2 would be used to track what attacks Dark Anima would use, but because it's constantly changing in encounters, likely due to character idle animations, it's impossible for a human to manipulate over a long period of time. RNG4 is used for several things, but for the Dark Anima fight, it's used in both Dark Anima targeting and the Maga Sisters commands. These are much easier to track since RNG4 updates when each action is taken. Over the last several years, an RNG tracker was developed by GreyFox96 with the help of many community members to help speedrunners RNG manipulate their attempts for preferable outcomes, and it was no surprise that Jane wanted to see if this could be used for Dark Anima. She's still working on this as of the writing of this video, approaching the Dark Anima clear in a fresh and new way. Her personal best overall is 7.3 million damage, which she achieved while I was writing this video on April 5th of 2026. And she's not going to stop until she gets her win. Someone by the name of Silo is also working on RNG manip, but their claim to fame is beating Dark Anima NSG with a mod that lets you fully control the Magus Sisters. Developed by Coryphean, it does exactly what it says, allowing you to access all the individual actions within each command, letting you manually target and use them without fail. It doesn't make the fight free, but given you can guarantee haste and auto life on all sisters without fail, the only complications come from attacks on the regular party. With that all being said, The story of Dark Anima's No Sphere Grid challenge is still being told. From the early days of Clink documenting strategies and laying the groundwork for years to come, then the grinds that would happen as a result, leading to Burke's first clear of Dark Anima NSG, to the latest generation of runners, each using new ways to push ever closer to completing a challenge that many thought would take a lifetime to do. The fight against this boss is far from finished, so please go watch everyone who is continuing to take on this boss. I left their channel links in the description. Also, a huge thanks to everyone who helped me research this video. Their names are on the screen, so please take a moment to appreciate them. They are really cool. As for you all, stay hydrated folks, and thank you all so much for watching.